Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here. We have some remarkable guests, and I want to offer a sincere thank you to the distinguished panelists who've taken time out of their busy schedule to join us here today, and that's Admiral Winnefeld, Ambassador Hill, and Ken Wainstein. And I'd also like to thank the CEL, my co-sponsor for this event, and especially Larry Meisel and Melanie Perlman for all of their work to make tonight a success. And let's acknowledge the leadership that they both provide. Last fall, Americans reflected on the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And as a nation, we reaffirmed our vow to never forget. But it's not enough just to remember. In the aftermath of the tragedy, we must apply the hard lessons we've learned in the months and the years after. And I want to set up our panel discussion here tonight by examining what I think those lessons are and how they can inform our actions in a post-9/11 world. When we went to war, we believed that global terrorism was our single greatest threat. We're now strategically hitting al-Qaeda and like-minded groups where they live, strangling their finances, and eliminating their leaders. And we can take satisfaction that Osama bin Laden is finally dead. But new threats have emerged. Clouds are gathering again in the Middle East. Iran continues to develop nuclear capabilities and has literally threatened to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and oil supplies to parts of Europe over new sanctions. UN inspectors trying to determine the possible military dimensions of the Iranian nuclear program have literally just today been denied access to suspected facilities. And Israel is warning that it may strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Syria is teetering on civil war. In Homs, the crackdown by the Assad government is so brutal that the Red Cross is working to negotiate daily ceasefires so the wounded can be evacuated. Egypt's interim government offers cause for serious concern, and Libya is far from stable. Pakistan continues to play both fireman and arsonist in an effort to hedge against Indian influence. Its growing economic and political instability, along with its status as a nuclear power, continue to raise the stakes in the region. Here in the United States, high-profile cyber attacks have raised anxieties about the security of our indispensable computer networks, and I believe the next major battlefield may well be in cyberspace. So how do we respond to these threats? We can't answer that without looking at the lessons we've learned since 9/11. Osama bin Laden envisioned 9/11 as the first in a series of attacks that would destroy our symbols and power centers, erode our confidence, and undermine our society from within. If you will, death by 1,000 cuts. Our response to a 21st century attack was to launch two 20th century style wars. 10 years later, many of our troops have spent half of the last decade in combat. Thousands of Coloradans have been killed or wounded, and those fortunate enough to come home have found an America drowning in debt from unpaid-for wars and deficit-financed tax cuts. And one of the most important lessons we've learned is that we cannot effectively project strength abroad if we're economically weak here at home. The national debt is one of the most significant threats to our national security. And in fact, Admiral Mike Mullen, the previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said exactly that in testimony to the Congress last year. I've been an evangelist on this subject. I strongly support the Bowles-Simpson blueprint that would reduce the deficit by over $4 trillion over 10 years. An important part of that debt reduction must include how we budget for the Defense Department. Make no mistake, we can trim the defense budget in ways that won't leave scars. U.S. defense spending dwarfs every other nation's security budget, and yet DOD has never done a full audit. I've long called for an accounting of our defense budget. We owe it to every American taxpayer to ensure that the Pentagon knows exactly what it's spending. Moreover, as we emerge from 2 ground wars, our budget situation requires that we be more strategic about how we use our limited resources to address today's threats. I'm reminded of that old saying that there's no limit to virtue, but there's a limit to dollars. I think the corollary is there's no limit to what we could do national security-wise, but there is a limit to dollars. Since I joined the Senate Intelligence Committee last year, one of my responsibilities has been to read reams of information about the threats, terrorist plots, and covert missions, information that's keeping me up at night. I'd like to tell you it's also turned my hair white, but that's my children that's done that. But I read those reams of information to ensure that we have the knowledge and the analysis to make critical national security decisions. And as our focus on big land armies gives way to a greater reliance on special operations missions and remote-controlled warfare, the boundaries between our intelligence agencies and military are blurring. If the world is now the battlefield, what limits are there on whom we strike and where? What responsibilities should our government have to share information with Congress and the American public? I believe we must redouble our efforts to align the use of advanced technology with our fundamental principles. We also must adapt our oversight and ensure we don't recreate a climate similar to that after 9/11, in which Congress passed overreaching laws in the name of security, or worse, where the administration actively pursued detention and surveillance programs without the Congress's knowledge. Some of those laws are still being interpreted in ways that are kept secret from the American public. As we seek to identify and combat threats in our midst, we must be honest with the American people about how we're doing so. I don't have to tell all of you here that the public's trust in government is at an all-time low, which in part is rooted in overreaches like these. The American people, I believe, are ahead of us. Conservatives and liberals alike have joined me in rejecting the argument that we must sacrifice liberty for security. In fact, public outrage served as a tailwind in my efforts to oppose authorizing the indefinite detention of Americans without charge. No threat can be effectively countered by eroding the right to speak openly or limiting constitutional protections. As we've bickered amongst ourselves about patriotism and overstepped constitutional boundaries, a narrative has developed that it's unpatriotic or weak to question how or where we use military force. But we must think decades out instead of only reacting to events in the next election cycle, or we risk taking on further commitments that we can ill afford. I agree with former Defense Secretary Gates, a great American, a patriotic American, who said, any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined. For example, we could easily topple the Assad regime in Syria, but we've learned that it's far costlier and more challenging to win the peace than to win the war. I opposed the Iraq War in part because we had no plan for what would happen after Saddam fell. Those fears were validated, and now we would be taking another unacceptable risk if we were to arm the Syrian opposition without knowing more about who they are. In the 21st century, our strength as a nation extends far beyond the barrel of a gun. Now, rest assured, we will continue to have the most powerful military in the world. But the U.S., we will. But the U.S. should never again have a doctrine of shoot first, ask questions later. I've come to believe that we need to reconsider how we strategically deploy not just what's known as hard power or coercive power, but smart power to seek what we want through relationships and influence. Consider Iran. If it continues its nuclear ambitions, Iran will pay dearly. And I believe that no option should be left off the table. But crippling new sanctions are already tightening the screws. It's not weak, I should say, to plan strategically and match tools to threats. Agreeing with Secretary Gates, I oppose another lengthy military engagement in the Middle East. And we should acknowledge that sending troops to Tehran could do more harm than good. Finally, in the 21st century, it will also be critical to understand and address potential conflicts and vulnerabilities before they surface. We know, for example, the most likely reason for unrest will be conflict over resources, such as water or oil. From a national security perspective, it's completely and absolutely irresponsible for us to continue our dependence on foreign oil. The addiction makes us beholden to an unstable region of the world, and every minute that we don't make developing renewable energy an economic imperative, we fall further behind nations like China, India, and Germany. The longer we're reliant on fossil fuel, the longer we're contributing to conditions that we know will lead to violent conflict, famine, and unrest in the decades to come. So where does that leave us? In my view, the next decade should be about recalibrating our national security strategy to meet new threats and budget realities. Some project an era of decline, but they don't know the America I know and you know. We'll continue to be, as that great Coloradan Madeleine Albright called, the indispensable nation. Let me end with this. The Great Seal of the United States depicts a bald eagle holding an olive branch in one set of talons and a set of arrows in the other. Over the eagle's head, a banner displays our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. I don't know about you all, but I've always found it thought-provoking that the eagle faces the olive branch while clearly brandishing the instruments of war. It's clear to me that that eagle, who is us, will do whatever it takes to defend our freedoms. And it's equally clear that our national symbol represents, even in the 21st century, the right national security posture, tough but smart, willing and able to deploy all of our weapons, starting with the Bill of Rights and including our economic, political, diplomatic, and military might. Thank you all for being here tonight. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Please welcome back Brendan Ritteman.
We got our members of the panel coming up here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. And thank you, Senator Udall, for that speech, and glad at least you haven't started pulling the hair out. It's just changing color on you, I suppose. All right. Well, we've got a lot of brain power up here and a lot of experience in foreign policy and diplomacy and national security, and we're honored tonight. We have a lot of people out here in military uniforms, but none of them have quite as many stripes on the sleeves as this man up here. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is the second highest ranking military officer in the country, Admiral James A. Winnefeld, Jr. For those who don't know, he's served here in Colorado as commander of NORAD Northcom. He has served with 3 fighter squadrons flying the F-14 Tomcat, and he's been an instructor for the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Immediately after the terrorist attacks on 9/11, he led the USS Enterprise through her 18th deployment, which included combat operations in Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. He has shore tours, including service in the Joint Chiefs Operations Directorate as senior aide to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as executive assistant to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Winnefeld's awards include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, Defense Superior Service Medal, and the Legion of Merit, as well as the Bronze Star. Please welcome the Admiral. Also here with us today, we have Mr. Kenneth Weinstein. In 2008, Mr. Weinstein was named Homeland Security Advisor to President Bush, with a portfolio covering the coordination of the nation's counterterrorism, homeland security, infrastructure protection, and disaster response and recovery efforts. Previously, Mr. Weinstein was confirmed by the Senate in 2006 after being nominated as the first Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Justice Department. In that position, he established and led the new National Security Division, which consolidated the department's law enforcement and intelligence activities on counterterrorism and counterintelligence matters. And in 2004, he was confirmed as U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., prior to that serving as General Counsel and then as Chief of Staff to FBI Director Robert Mueller. Please welcome Mr. Weinstein. I'm not going to be standing at this podium all night. We have a moderator for this evening's discussion, Ambassador Christopher Hill, right here next to me. Ambassador Hill currently serves as Dean of International Studies at the University of Denver. Previously, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from April 2009 until August 2010. Ambassador Hill is a career member of the Foreign Service, whose prior assignment was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He also has served as ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and in 2005 was named as the head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issues. He has also served as U.S. ambassador to Poland, the Republic of Macedonia, and as special envoy to Kosovo. Ambassador Hill received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award for his contributions as a member of the U.S. negotiating team in the Bosnia peace settlement, and was a recipient of several awards for peace negotiations for his work on the Kosovo crisis. Please welcome Ambassador Hill. Looking forward to a great discussion. Ambassador Hill, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and let me welcome you all here. It is a great pleasure for me to be back here. I want to thank Larry Meisel for once again putting this together with his really excellent team here, and especially to thank Senator Udall for really hosting this event. Now, what we have in mind here is to maybe have a free-flowing but pretty rapid-fire discussion of some of the problems out there in the world, because this is now the 11th year after 9/11, and lo and behold, the world is still a pretty troubled and in many cases a very dangerous place. So in kind of looking at all the issues we confront today, we tried to put together a sort of set of issues and maybe discuss those in some sequence. And the first is the issue of nuclear aspirations from countries that, frankly speaking, ought to be doing something else, like playing with their children or something. But so we have, I think, probably the most urgent one today is Iran. And there are often some conflicting signals coming out of Iran, but as we learned just today, as Senator Udall pointed out, we have the Iranians not cooperating with the inspectors that they said they would cooperate with just some 3 days ago. So I think Iran is sort of on the top 10 list. But I would also like, in the context of talking about nuclear aspirants, to raise the always fun, always entertaining North Koreans. The North Koreans were not denied their place in world news in the last few months. Kim Jong-il, who had been Kim Jong very ill for a while, became no longer. And so he was replaced by his rather well-fed son, Kim Jong-un. And so his name is actually Jong-un. You don't just call him Un. And so Kim Jong-un, I think there are a lot of fair questions about whether he is sort of ready for prime time. As is usual with North Korea, we don't know a lot about it. It's a place that the word opaque, I think, is a good description, and it's a country that really kind of takes pride in its opaqueness. So I think that would be an issue to talk about in the context of these nuclear wannabes. I think we're going to talk about Pakistan in terms of a second category, but I think Pakistan could also be in the category of a country whose nuclear stockpile is of concern. After all, if one wanted to take an alarmist view, and often an alarmist view is probably a sober view, they are sort of one angry mob away from a loose nuke. Afghanistan is one angry mob and maybe about 300 years away from a loose nuke. But nonetheless, I think to talk about Afghanistan together with Pakistan makes some sense. And finally, in this category, I think we also ought to be discussing the situation in Iraq. I mean, in both these places, Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States has begun, I think, a very important withdrawal, strategic withdrawal of our forces in Iraq. Our forces are already out of the country. In Afghanistan, the expectation is that in the next couple of years or so, and maybe before, we will also have U.S. military forces out of there. Now, some newspapers, if you read the press, already has kind of written the narrative that in Iraq, U.S. forces leave, all heck breaks loose. I would argue, as someone who spent some time there, is what we're seeing breaking loose in Iraq is a very tough form of local politics. Not nearly as tough as what we've got going in the U.S., of course. I mean, they're kind of amateurs compared to what goes on here. But I think we also have something that is very dangerous in Iraq, and that is the notion that there's some kind of great game underway, that Iran thinks that maybe Iraq is a place where they could exert influence for some years to come, while the Sunni Arab countries, already very much concerned about what is going on in the Sunni Arab world, in the Arab Spring, otherwise known as the Arab Thing, because first of all, it has nothing to do with spring. It's been going on longer than that. And frankly, when you start disaggregating what's going on in the Arab world, you'll see there's a lot of complexity there. But one thing among Sunni Arab countries is they'd rather not see a Shia Arab country, which is really what Iraq has become. So I think there are a lot of interesting elements to Iraq, and of course in Afghanistan, because that is where it all began. That is where people who came and attacked our cities, attacked our people, that is where they were trained, and that is why that is also an issue, important issue we need to discuss. And then I think finally it's very important to see sort of how kind of buttoned up we are. How are we prepared to face these threats in our homeland? And I think we're very fortunate to have on this panel someone who can really speak to those issues. What are the new threats? They're not all the threats that we confronted on September 12th, 2001. There are other things, and I think Senator Udall spoke very eloquently about the issue of cyber threats and other things like that, threats to our homeland. So we've got a huge agenda. I think we've got something like 45 minutes to go through this huge agenda, followed by, I think, a question period of some 25 minutes. Someone's supposed to be giving a chopping signal to her neck when I've gone on too long, so I'll look for her to do that. But why don't we start really with a discussion about the situation in Iran. After all, this is a situation where we have gotten a number of countries to work together with us. We've gotten we've gotten countries such as in Europe, we have support there. We've had a real effort at multilateralism, and I think also there's a growing sense that countries are prepared to initiate some fairly harsh sanctions. A number of the European countries are going to do that. In fact, the European Union, I think, is going to be prepared to complete that process by June. I know the Republic of Korea is also looking to free themselves of Iranian oil. So let me start with a sort of softball question to Senator Udall. Do you think these sanctions are going to work? And if they don't, what's next?
I think we should do everything possible to give these sanctions an opportunity to work. The two things that are keeping me up at night are the financial situation in Europe in what's happening in Iran. That's not to say what's happening in Syria, Egypt, and Korea, as well as our own economic straits, aren't very, very important. There are some significant signs that the sanctions are biting. The rial has dropped about 50% in valuation. You could argue that these clumsy attacks against Israeli diplomats in capitals around the world are an indication that the Iranians are lashing out. The plot to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, as ham-handed and comical as it sounded, is real and was real. And by the way, we should tip our hats to leaders like Admiral Winnefeld and Ken Weinstein, who put in place the structures so that our domestic law enforcement and counterterrorism efforts were successful in that undertaking. That's the good news. The bad news is the bad guys only have to get it right once, and that's why we've got to be ever vigilant. There are sanctions that are, back to Iran, that are going to follow on that will be even more biting. As I said, every option should be left on the table, but one of the reasons that I think we have to continue to push these sanctions is once you begin to engage militarily, you never quite know what is going to come next, whether it was Israel, the United States, or Israel in concert with the United States attacking Iran. Potentially you unleash a lot of forces over which we don't have much control. I'll end on this note. The worst thing in the world would be to get into a war with Iran, but an even worse thing would be if they're a nuclear power, because it would change the geopolitical balance in the region. The Saudis would want a Sunni bomb. The Iraqis would be tempted themselves. Any country with significant oil revenues could probably buy a set of nuclear weapons. And we also have, of course, the comments that Ahmadinejad, Khamenei, and other Iranian leaders have made about Israel. I think we should take those comments seriously. But those two possibilities, the Iranians actually using a bomb, which would be suicidal, but you never know when a madman might lead a country, and the change of the geopolitical balance are unacceptable for the long-term stability of the world.
Senator, one of the issues has always been on sanctions is whether they're enforceable. I mean, whether we can really get countries to support those. I wonder if either of our other panelists want to speak to the issue of sanctions enforcement and whether we can really make them stick with Iran. Admiral?
Well, I would say that we're seeing a lot of success with that right now with Iran. We're getting a lot of cooperation, as you pointed out, I think, from our European partners. The European Union has really ratcheted this up. I think one of you also mentioned the Republic of Korea. We would, of course, like to see a little more cooperation out of a couple of other key nations in the world, China being one, to reduce their oil imports from Iran, and there are others as well. But these things are starting to bite. They're going to get worse and tighter as the year goes on. Starting in June and July, the automatic mechanisms are going to tighten them up even more, and we are starting to see the pinch, as you've pointed out.
We've seen already the Iranians try to sort of bite back by saying, well, they're going to cut out the UK from Iranian oil. Of course, the UK only gets 1% of their oil from Iran. But overall, on the issue of sort of biting back, looking for ways to come back at us for this, I wonder, Ken, if you can talk about some of that from a Homeland Security perspective.
Yeah, I think we need to brace ourselves. We need to be prepared because you're already hearing rhetoric that they're saying that they're victims of economic terrorism, that they're victims of terrorism themselves, which many read as sort of a prelude to their using terrorism in retaliation for the sanctions. Obviously, the same thing would be doubly true if there's some sort of military action against them, and no matter where that military action came from, the betting is that the retaliation would come back at us. Historically, Iran has not focused terrorist efforts against the homeland, against the U.S., and for very practical reasons. They've worried that our retaliation for that would be so severe that it just doesn't pass the cost-benefit analysis. They haven't had Hezbollah come after us. We had, a murder here back in the 1980s where Iranians killed somebody, but they haven't done that until recently. And the senator mentioned that plot where the Iranians it was a pretty ham-handed thing. Many people don't believe that it was actually sanctioned at the highest levels of the Iranian government, but apparently the evidence is there that there was Quds Force involvement. The Quds Force is an arm of the Revolutionary Guard of the Iranian government, and a member of the Quds Force is actually charged with that offense. It was ham-handed, but they were trying to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in the United States in Washington, D.C. Many people are concerned that that is a change in course for the Iranians and might be a function of them lashing out as a result of these sanctions. So I think you're seeing in the Homeland and national security infrastructure a readying for what might come even short of any military action directed at Iran.
Chris, if I can add to what Ken said, you know, these 4 recent plots, you know, Thailand, India, Georgia, and of course the plot for the ambassador here, as clumsy as they were, it indicates sort of a brazen approach that these guys are willing to reach out into other people's capitals, and they don't seem to care about the effects. And so what that tells us is that one of these days they might be successful someplace. And so they only have to get one through. We have to defend perfectly against every single one of them. And in that light, one of the best things that I've had a chance to observe in the last, over the last 10 years is the tremendous, and Senator Udall can attest this by virtue of his position on the intelligence committee, is the tremendous improvement in our intelligence community's crosstalk and cooperation with one another. It's remarkable to see how far they've come in 10 years, and you've seen, and sometimes you haven't seen, the results of that cooperation.
Senator, you've had the opportunity to get out to the region to talk to some governments out there. What's your sense from the region about their willingness to really stand up to Iran? What I worry about is you have the Saudis being very tough now, but if it ever came to using military power, if we used overflights of Saudi Arabia, we might get a kind of different point of view. What's your sense, having gone out to the region, talked to a number of governments?
My sense is almost to a country, there's deep concern about a nuclear-armed Iran. There's also a hope that the Israelis, who are of course scapegoated in many other settings, or the Americans, or both, will take out the Iranian threat, however you want to define that threat. But Master, as you point out, it's a complicated part of the world. You certainly have to put a lens that takes into account Shia and Sunni perspectives, but then you also have historical trends. You have countries that are rich in oil, others that aren't. It's a fascinating part of the world if it wasn't so doggone unstable and such a threat to all that we hold dear.
What I worry about with Iran is, and I went through this when I was in Iraq, we have those hikers, you remember,
Yes, yeah,
who kind of inexplicably decided that the best place in the world to go, I mean, if they just came to Colorado, I mean, how many mountains? So, but instead of coming to Colorado, they go out from Sulaymaniyah, and lo and behold, they get arrested by Iranian border guards. Sulaymaniyah is a town in the eastern part of Iraq, the northeastern part of Iraq. And then they released one of the hikers, the woman, and then it was very clear there were these internal problems in Iran where they simply couldn't decide what to do with the other two. And it took them something like 2 years. This was long after they realized these were not threats, that they were basically people sort of challenged by their IQ to go up to mountain climbing next to Iran. But they were no threat at all. It took them 2 years.
yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, I was saying I'm a mountain climber. Be careful.
So,
yeah, and I think we should talk a little more about Iran and if not exhaust the topic, I think there are a couple other comments I'd like to make. D&I Clapper, who heads the intelligence architecture in the federal government, and Admiral Winnefeld mentioned how we're much more integrated. I know Mike Davis is here from the FBI, or formerly the FBI now works for the governor. Our Homeland Security efforts here was a part of this. But let's see, I lost my train of thought. Director Clapper was saying it's clear, and he said this in open session, so I can share with you, that the Iranians haven't made the final decision to go. At the same time, there's discussion of the zone of immunity as to the point at which Iran can fend off any attempts to deny them the capability to make a nuclear weapon. I would like to say that I know there's a school of thought that given the intense nationalistic fervor of Iranians, formerly Persians, they've been a nation for many, many years, that were we to attack Iran, the narrative would be this is the very reason that we need to have a bomb within Iran. If we'd had a bomb, we wouldn't have been attacked. I don't know how we thread that needle. I'll continue to say we keep all options on the table. But one of the things we're playing for is time. The Iranian population is 65 to 70% under the age of 35. They're very Western-oriented. They have affection for the United States, which may surprise some Americans. I think it would surprise the Iranian leadership. And if we can continue in a manner in which they make the right decision, and this new youthful cohort takes control over the country, then I'm hopeful. But that's a thin reed right now on which to hold our hopes. But it's the most vexing problem and challenge I've faced in my 13 years in the Congress, and I speak for all of us who sit on the Intelligence Committee. We were spending a lot of time understanding what the options are and what the best course of action may be.
I think it's very important what we've done in Iran is to continue to get support from our friends and allies with the understanding that Iran is a problem to us. Frankly, I think it's a threat to us. But we're not the only country under threat. There are many other countries. And what's, I think, very important is to make sure that we approach this multilaterally such that if we ever have to go to all those options on the table, we will have support from others, and we will do that together in coalition.
You make peace with your enemies, unfortunately, and so the diplomatic path is one down which we have to continue to travel. In the end, you also have to ask yourself, what is the reason for the use of force? Clausewitz famously said, war is an extension of politics. What is the end state? Were we to attack Iran, were the Israelis to attack Iran? What is the outcome we want to generate? Thinking that by attacking them, we're going to somehow eliminate their capacity to develop nuclear weapons is, I think, flawed thinking, or at least short-term thinking. This is why the history that will be written, hopefully a positive history, it will be beyond fascinating. And we also finally, and I'm talking way too much, but I've been living this day in and day out, we need to continue to drive wedges within the Iranian leadership. If you think about really the structure of that country, it's a garden variety military dictatorship with a patina of religiosity, quite frankly. And Khamenei really needs, in my opinion, to hold on to power through the production, or at least the threat, of a nuclear weapon. The Revolutionary Guards run the country's businesses. They're beginning to really feel the pinch. And that may be where the leverage is, along with the younger cohort there. But again, I don't want to be a Pollyanna here. This is a very complicated and dangerous situation. And I've talked way too much, and I want to hear from my friends up here.
Admiral, any comments on coalitions there?
Coalitions.
In understanding the threat posed by Iran and the fact that we're not the only country that needs to oppose that threat.
Sure. I think that we have a very large coalition of countries across the world who are recognizing and have recognized for a long time. You know, this has been a subject of academic discussion for decades, at least two, since I've been in the military, about what is the consequence of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. And our European partners are quite resolute in this regard. Our partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the Gulf countries, are quite resolute in this regard. Clearly, Israel's very resolute in this regard. And there are other countries, you know, Australia, other friends around the world, that clearly recognize that this would be a real challenge if Iran, an irresponsible nation or irresponsibly led nation, were to obtain that. So we've got a very strong backing, and I think the key is to keep it together, to keep the sanctions moving in the right direction, and to give them an opportunity to work. And that's our policy right now, is to try to do that. But it's a multi-vector approach. As you know, as a diplomat, a great deal of diplomacy is being expended in this regard. A lot of economic and financial power being expended in this regard. Law enforcement power. The FBI did a fantastic job with this case, with the ambassador from Saudi Arabia being threatened. And of course, as the Senator said, and as the President has said, you know, all options are on the table. So there's a military dimension to this. But I think we have to be cautious in the use of force, and that's the President's call, of course.
Right. If I just add to that, talking about coalition building, many levels of coalition building to face any threat. And one thing I think we've seen since 9/11 is coalition building on the political level and military level. But what I've seen is the coalition building at the intelligence community and law enforcement level. And after 9/11, that was not something that just automatically happened. A lot of people rallied to our side because they saw the horror that had been inflicted on us. But our intelligence and law enforcement partners, especially in Europe, had to change course. They had to become much more aggressive in terms of trying to root out terrorists. They had to see that they had a common threat with us and that it was our common interest in working closely together. So I think we've seen that. There's a template forged in that regard after 9/11, and I think we're seeing it with every crisis since then, and probably seeing it with Iran as well.
You know, in that regard, when I worked on North Korea, there were a lot of people who felt we should deal directly with the North Koreans, and we did, but we did it on a platform with other countries. And it was very important for the North Koreans to understand that they were not just dealing with the U.S., they were dealing with all their neighbors who also didn't accept that this country that cannot feed itself should be developing nuclear weapons. Now, the North Koreans are not what I would call fast learners. This is going to take some time, but as of today, and I think it starts tomorrow, we have our envoy in the six-party process, extremely capable Foreign Service officer named Glenn Davies, and he is meeting with the North Koreans in Beijing. And an important part of what we're doing in meeting with them is to show the public in Korea, in South Korea, that gets very worried when there's no communication, because after all, they're within a few miles of North Korea. I mean, Seoul is about as far from North Korea as Colorado Springs is from here, Mr. Congressman. So the South Koreans want to see that we're really doing our best there. And I think we've dispatched a very, very capable diplomat and a team to talk to the North Koreans, and importantly talk to China, because I think in China we have a country that if we can work it out well, and if the kind of old think that goes on in China right now, which would be North Korean demise and American victory, our loss, if we can kind of get over this zero-sum thinking in China, I think we could maybe make some progress, because I think China has some leverage with the North Koreans. So this is, I think, an important thing to kind of keep at.
Does not China play really the crucial role in this question? I know there was the old saying that the French, who had a long history of enmity with the Germans, were so fond of Germany that they liked the fact there were two of them. That's a tongue-in-cheek comment. And I've heard the same thing said about China. They like Korea so much, they like the fact that there are two of them, because they have a long historical record of competing, of warring, of not always the fondest feelings for each other.
Yeah. The difference is I don't recall the Koreans ever marching through Beijing, as I seem to recall the Germans doing now and again through Paris. I think I think what we do need to keep in mind is the Korean Peninsula needs the final settlement in the Korean Peninsula, first of all, needs to happen. And Korean people have a right to determine how it happens. They have a right to unification. They have a historical right to unification. But how that happens is not just their business, it's a lot of people's business, including our own. So I think the goal should be to try to reduce the tensions and manage the problem. I would love to see the North Koreans, I'd love to see Kim Jong-un fall out of bed. Well, actually, I'd just like to see him fall out of bed, but fall out of bed and realize that these nuclear weapons that they're developing, and by the way, they've tested two of them. They've tested two plutonium weapons, that this will have nothing to do with helping their country through its very difficult future. And I think we have a number of options to deal with North Korea, and there too I would take nothing off the table. But I think it's very important that we keep at it, that the South Koreans know that we're serious about finding a solution, and that the Chinese increasingly come to understand that in finding a solution, we're not looking for a solution at Chinese expense. We're looking for win-win. And I know many Chinese think win-win is some kind of Burmese dissident or something. Actually, win-win is a concept that I think the Chinese could try to embrace.
Don't stop him,
So,
he's on a roll.
Yeah. I just love talking about North Korea.
You know, Chris, I just want to tell you that
pick them up and hug them. You know, it's.
You know, Chris, I I just want to tell you that my many friends from Colorado Springs here tonight are a heck of a lot more responsible than those guys. Come on, guys. Anyway. You know, one of the things that we've said, one of the things that Secretary Clinton has said is that we're not going to pay for the same thing twice with the North Koreans anymore. We've been in this cycle where North Korea will feel a little pressure, they will start rattling sabers, they'll do some irresponsible act, and that brings everybody back to the table, you know, get these guys back under control, and Secretary Clinton has said we're not going to do that again, and I think we're going to see a pretty tough line this time around in Korea, in North Korea. And the North Koreans are hurting right now. They have the worst famine they've had in a long time. They need to feed their people, and obviously you don't want to hold that over anybody's head, but they have a concern about the stability, their own stability. So there is a little bit of a bargaining chip there, and we think potentially we could make some progress this time around, but we're not going to pay for the same ground twice.
I agree. Senator, you want to follow up on that?
I think you've covered the waterfront nicely, and what really strikes me is how close North Korea is to Seoul, and that threat that just overarches that country day in and day out. And thank you for all the work you did there, and I know there's nobody that wants a solution more badly than you do. You invested a lot of time and money and opportunity cost in those efforts.
I didn't invest any money in it, I'll tell you
that's
that. But I wonder maybe if we could kind of shift back to this, and it's kind of related to Asia in another sense. We've pulled out of Iraq, and we're pulling out of Afghanistan. And I think there's a kind of broad question, what are we leaving behind? Are we leaving the wherewithal in those countries to kind of deal with their problems? Are we leaving an impression that we don't have enough stick-to-itiveness? Now, I'll answer my own question. I think we have shown the world that we mean business when we go into a country, and there's just no country that has done what we've done in that sense. But I mean, what is the impression you think we've left? And I wonder if we can kind of talk about that overall situation right now. Senator.
I desperately want Iraq to succeed. I think to comment in the short number of months since we've fully withdrawn our combat forces about the future prospects of Iraq is short-sighted, and it's too soon to draw any definitive conclusions. I think we all would have wished, and I haven't talked to the Admiral about this, to have seen a long-term security agreement with Iraq where we would have continued to have a presence to train their military, their police, offer the kind of assistance that we do, I think, in close to 100 countries. We have strong military-to-military relationships all over the world. I think many of you here know what a great service our military provides in that regard. It's one of the reasons that the revolution in Egypt was so peaceful. Our military leaders were talking to the Egyptian military leadership cohort. And unlike Syria, where al-Assad has shown himself to be his father's son, the Egyptian army did not attack the Egyptian citizens. There are conversations with the Iraqis about a long, ongoing relationship. I think, Chris, you put it well when you talked about their local politics. Maliki has his hands full. I have been worried about seemingly some of the purges of Sunnis in his government. The Kurds are self-sufficient, but they're a key to a strong, united Iraq. And I don't know that Maliki has included the Kurdish leadership in the ways that would be productive going forward. But we spent our reputation, our treasure, and most importantly, American lives in Iraq. And there's nobody more than me that wants it to be successful on Iraqi terms. I'm not as worried as some that Iraq will sign an unholy alliance with Iran. The nationalistic sentiments in Iraq are pretty well established. And they've long been suspicious of Iranian, parentheses, Persian influence. But we can't ignore Iraq. We shouldn't be in a mood that our feelings were hurt because they asked us to leave. We need to redouble our efforts. And look, after all, they saw us as occupiers. They're proud people. Their political leaders in various forms have played the American presence for their own political purposes. So I think there are reasons that we're where we are, but I remain hopeful that Iraq will find its way to a more democratic, capitalistic system that will create some stability in the Middle East.
Chris, and it's hard to speak about Iraq when you've got the real experts sitting here on the stage, but
It's grading us.
right.
Yeah.
But Iraq is probably never going to be a Jeffersonian democracy, but it is an opportunity for representative government to gain a foothold in that very troubled part of the world. And through the sacrifices of a great number of men and women in uniform, a number of very talented diplomats, young and old diplomats, and USAID workers, and just a whole host of coalition partners who were there with us, we have, I think, over the last, 8 years now, 9 years, placed them in a place where they have an opportunity to succeed. And it is a tumultuous form of democracy with three very scratchy factions, as you well know, Ambassador. But what gives us hope, I think, is that they tend to get to the brink of fracturing, and then they pull back. And it is an opportunity for representative government to have a foothold. And I think one of the things that we ought to be watchful for, first of all, we have the largest diplomatic mission from our nation is in Iraq right now. Many, many diplomats on the ground there doing great work under fairly difficult conditions. And our sense is that the Iraqis were like sort of pushing your son or daughter out the door at the end of December. They just wanted to make a statement about their sovereignty, which is one of the reasons why we don't have a large troop presence there right now. But they have sent the signals to us all along that they would like to have a robust training relationship with us. And I think sooner or later, as long as they can hold their stuff together, that we'll be back in there on a very reasonable scale, very similar to other nations in the region that we train with and who we support. And I think it will work out in the long run. And there are a lot of other nations in the Middle East. A lot of young people are watching this and hoping that it succeeds.
Ken, you were in the White House in some very tough times in Iraq. I'm sure you were in with the president on a number of occasions. I wonder if you can talk retrospectively and prospectively about how you see the situation.
I was in the White House in 2008 to 2009, so there was improvement, but it was still terribly troubling, and obviously that was one of the centerpieces of President Bush's 8 years of work in the White House. And I think there's no small satisfaction in the positive developments that we've seen over the last few years, thanks in large part to the entities represented by the people on either side of me, the diplomatic efforts and the military efforts. But I can tell you that there was serious anxiety whenever there was any incident, whenever there was anything that looked like sectarian strife was going to get out of hand again. They'd seen what had happened. They were terribly afraid of anything, seeing a repeat of what had happened in the aftermath of the invasion, and wanted to take every step possible to try to prevent it from spreading any farther. But if I could actually just go back to your question about what we leave. We talked about what we leave in Iraq, and then you also asked about what we leave in Afghanistan. And I think it's important that we all recognize the reason why Afghanistan was so important to our national security, and I believe it was you, Ambassador, who said that's where it all began. It being the 9/11 plot evolved out of there because that was a safe haven, and it was a safe haven under the Taliban. It was a safe haven for a number of historical reasons, dating back to the fact that that's where a number of like-minded extremists had congregated in opposition to the Soviets. It's a place that is prone to extremism, and it's a place that was relatively ungoverned, and so therefore was hospitable to a terrorist group establishing a command and control center and then launching attacks around the world. That is no longer the case, but we all have to keep our eye on the prevention of that happening again, and Afghanistan falling back into the position of being a safe haven for a regeneration of core al-Qaeda. At this point, thanks to the efforts over the last few years, core al-Qaeda is on the run. It's its operations have been disrupted, its leadership has been decimated, but it wouldn't take much complacency on our part to allow a safe haven to recur in that area. And obviously, that's not the only place in the world you look at. You look anywhere there's ungoverned regions, whether it's Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan. Those are the areas where you have to worry about these kind of terrorist entities getting a foothold, getting strength, getting the capacity to launch attacks overseas, and then, heaven forbid, launching the next 9/11.
Senator, what's your sense of the politics in Afghanistan? Is Karzai kind of up to this?
I was hoping you'd answer that question. President Karzai is charming. He's Western educated. He's smart. He's the product of a tribal environment. He lives in fear, or the people around him, of a car bomb, an attack like the one that killed his brother, who was a leader in Kandahar, one of the important provinces in the south. He alternately frustrates and elevates our hopes for the future. One of the big questions about President Karzai will be, will he step down in 2014? My sense is that he will. Then who's going to be leading Afghanistan? Who will be running for the presidency at the same time that we're really beginning to fully draw down our combat forces? Now, let me just say more broadly, I think we're on the right trajectory in Afghanistan. There are some who think we ought to leave sooner. There are others that think we ought to stay for a longer period of time on the combat side. We're going to need, and Ken alluded to this, a longer-term relationship with Afghanistan, a security agreement, if you will, that hopefully will be focused on training their ANSF, their Afghan National Security Forces, local police, their national police, and their army, so they can defend their borders, they can manage their internal affairs, and they can prevent al-Qaeda from ever taking root in Afghanistan again. We've got a long road to travel. We took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan. We fought a series of one-year conflicts. We didn't really, and there are some who would probably disagree. I don't think we really had a strategy there. It was why I alluded to the setting aside where we are in Iraq now, why I thought we should have finished the job in Afghanistan first. But I would add one other major concern. I think the Admiral would agree with me. It's very difficult to beat an insurgency with a counterinsurgency when the insurgents have safe havens. Safe havens are in Pakistan. And until those safe havens are shut down or pressured more than they are now, particularly by the Pakistanis, it's going to be difficult to win the kind of complete victory that we want. The Haqqani network you've heard about is vicious. They're, by all accounts, given tacit approval by some in the Pakistani government. And I know the Admiral and I would love to see the Haqqani network neutered. It would go a long way to protecting our men and women who are over there fighting on behalf of the Afghan people.
If I could ask the Admiral to comment on that. There was a very high-profile trip a few months ago led by the Secretary of State to essentially confront the Pakistanis on the Haqqani network. And you sort of have the impression that the Pakistani government, because they cannot manage the problem themselves for whatever reason, and I suspect there are a number of reasons, because they cannot manage the problem of the Haqqani network, they try to tell us that that's not the network we really ought to be focusing on. They try to then, because they can't manage it, they try to tell us it's not really a problem anyway. Anyway, I wonder if, Admiral, you can talk about dealing with the Pakistanis on some of these issues.
You know, Chris, if I told you how nice it is to be back in Colorado, it truly is, by the way. The Pakistanis are partners, but they're very, very difficult partners. Probably the most difficult partners we have across the world. But I would rather have them as partners than not have them as partners, because it's a terribly important part of the world. They do have nuclear weapons. They do have an entree with China, and probably very important and relevant to this discussion is they have tremendous influence with the issues we have in Afghanistan. So as difficult as they are, and I can outline for hours the challenges associated with that partnership, they've also been a good partner in some areas. They've helped us with intelligence. They've helped us. They've lost an awful lot of soldiers along the border. There are some positive aspects of the relationship. We'd like to move that forward. You know, Secretary Clinton's meeting with their foreign minister tomorrow. It's going to be an interesting discussion because of some of the recent events that we've had with the cross-border attack that unfortunately killed 24 Pakistani soldiers, where mistakes were made on both sides, which the Pakistanis have had a hard time getting across. Perhaps it's a stalking horse for other issues that they wanted to raise with us. But we need to get this relationship back on track because, as the Senator pointed out, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to succeed with the mission in Afghanistan if the safe havens are active.
Can you agree a relationship too big to fail, too important to fail?
It is. It's terribly complex. I, once again, saw it from the perspective of working at the intelligence level and at the law enforcement level, and there were times where they were brilliantly effective and brilliantly cooperative. Other times where they would just be inexplicably difficult, and it was sort of hard to understand. And part of it was trying to understand the passion of their feelings vis-a-vis India and how that just seems to color every policy decision they make. Every decision whether to cooperate with us or not seems to be looked at through that prism, because that just seems to be the biggest focus of their lives. And there was an irrational element to it. So that was very frustrating, but I will say there were times that they really came through for us and were very strong. Other times, quite the opposite.
So within some of the intel relationships, as the Admiral was alluding, they have come through for us. They've cooperated.
Yeah, and you can read about how the ISI, the intelligence services, there are different parts of the ISI, and there are parts that it's known that you can pretty much trust and work with that part. The other part is probably as soon as you walk out the door after your meeting and everybody grins and shakes hands, they're on the phone with the Haqqani network.
You know, it's interesting in context of my career, there are times when a certain government, who from the general public's point of view is a pretty terrible government in country X, but they've worked with us on some very key things. They've remanded terrorists, for example. They've done things that we don't talk about. We don't talk about publicly because we've agreed that we'll never address that publicly, but we know about it within the government. And yet, the New York Times doesn't know about it, and nor are we going to tell them, so they kind of have half the story. And it is a little frustrating at times to see countries kind of really held up on a stake there, when in fact that country may have done some things for us that we can't talk about. So,
Chris, I think earlier the Senator referred to Pakistan, I think very appropriately, as both the arsonist and the fireman. And there are examples abound, but we would love for them, for example, to quit allowing calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizer coming across the border into Afghanistan so it can be made into improvised explosive devices. But at the same time, we're about to put Khalid Sheikh Mohammed on trial, who was the lead 911 plotter, and we would not be doing this unless Pakistan had handed him over to us. So it's one of those classic love-hate relationships, and again, better to have them as a partner than an enemy.
Just to follow on your point about some governments that might not be the most savory in many ways being very helpful in the counterterrorism area, there are a number of instances I can think of involving governments that have turned over in the Arab Spring. And so obviously, given the Arab Spring or the Arab thing, there are serious implications for our counterterrorism efforts over there because of the disruption of those relationships.
all right, well, enough with that difficult problem. Let's go to an easy one, Syria. Now, as I understand it, in Syria, you got Darth Vader over here and Ewok villages over there. But Senator, you're suggesting that may be a little more complicated than that?
Syria is very complicated. You have a Alawite Shia minority that runs the country. The al-Assad family is an example, a leading example of that Shia sect. You have an uprising that's driven more by Sunni Syrians than not. Christians are concerned that were Sunnis to overthrow the Assad government, that they may be persecuted, and unfortunately there have been some incidents along those lines. There are also other religious minorities, as well as Kurds, in the southeastern corner of Syria. Having said all of that, I think on balance, it would be a benefit to the world and to the region if the al-Assad regime fell. What follows is the big question. I read an interesting piece, I can mention the New York Times here, I think. Today in the New York Times that analyzed where the Israeli government was, and the Israeli government's having a significant conversation among its leaders about whether Syria's fall would unleash chaos, which would affect Israel's stability, or not. And on balance, I think the Israelis think that this will happen, it needs to happen, it should happen at some time in history, even though the risks are great. The prize, if that's the right term, would be worth it. As to what we should do, we should continue to encourage the Arab League. Although the observer mission was a failure, we should continue to urge the Arab League to be a strong participant. We need to jawbone Russia and China, who vetoed a Security Council resolution to sanction further Syria. We should, in our own way with our European partners, continue to implement sanctions on Syria. We can encourage the Turks to broaden the refugee areas that are along their border. We can set up a contact group to funnel humanitarian aid. And we should continue to have the discussion about whether we arm the rebels. But as I said in my remarks, we don't really know who the rebels are. And although we're desperate to stop the killing, I think we need to know more about who the rebels are. Al-Qaeda reportedly has moved from Iraq and some other areas into Syria. And this is why the politics, to say the least, in this part of the world are very complex. And your enemy of your enemy may be my enemy too, or the enemy of your enemy may be my friend. It's just, it's a very, very challenging situation. But I know we all, in the end, see Assad for who he is. And I think by that, I mean, I think he's a puppet. I think he's, and I may be offending somebody by saying that, I think there are forces behind him in Syrian society that continue to keep him in place. Until those forces see an advantage or a reason for the regime to fall, I think this terrible civil war will continue. And the difference between a Libya and a Syria, final comment, Muammar Gaddafi was a pariah. Muammar Gaddafi had no allies. Muammar Gaddafi had an army that was vaguely interested in a chain of command. By contrast, Syria has allies, it has a big military, and obviously the leadership of the country is willing to use it against their own citizens.
Admiral, we must be meeting new friends in the context of this change in just historic change in the Arab world. There must be new people we're getting to know that we didn't know before. I would think Libya is one of those. And then there must be some old friends that we've kind of lost and we're not sort of sure who we're going to meet. I mean, our military does well because they have these counterparts all over the world, and yet everything's been kind of turned upside down. How does it affect how we do there?
Well, I can tell you with confidence we didn't have a lot of military counterparts in Syria or Libya, but we do have a very good and solid relationship with our military counterparts in Egypt. And I would tell you that in the darkest days a year ago when they were in the convulsions that they were going through in Egypt, that one of the things that kept the military from engaging its own people, which is terribly important, was the fact that we had a strong military-to-military relationship, and everyone was able to call his counterparts over there and urge them to not do the wrong thing, but to do the difficult right thing. And we've all seen what happened as a result. And this is a pattern that's repeated itself. As you recall, when Russia invaded Georgia, no one in our government was speaking with the Russians at all, except for Admiral Mullen and General Makarov, because we had essentially broken off contact. So maintaining those relationships is an absolutely critical part of our diplomacy, frankly. And so.
Ken, any comments from your perspective on? I think it was on your watch that the Georgia-Russia
Yeah, okay.
war started.
I'll take the blame for that.
Yeah, you didn't prevent that. As I recall,
Got
it was
a
like
weak guy at the HSA there. Let's
it's
go.
like the first day of the Olympics, as I recall.
It was. In fact,
Yeah.
I think Putin and President Bush were in the audience together. Yes. And as I recall, our president gave their president a piece of his mind about it. I would like to just comment on Syria. Senator Udall mentioned the concern about Al-Qaeda in Iraq coming over and joining in the effort in Syria to unseat the government. And that, it's become clear that that is a focus of core Al-Qaeda. In other words, the core Al-Qaeda over in the Pakistan safe havens over there. Zawahiri, the now #1 since the killing of bin Laden, recently released a 10-minute videotape lauding the efforts of the rebels, the revolutionaries in Syria, trying to align Al-Qaeda with them so they can get a foothold and they can help color that rebellion or uprising with their own ideology. He's failed that miserably. In fact, I think over the last year, one might say that the killing of bin Laden is the biggest blow that Al-Qaeda has suffered, but an argument could be made that the Arab Spring is equally devastating to Al-Qaeda because it just left Al-Qaeda behind. And Zawahiri, he tried to, he's from Egypt. He was tortured in the cells back in the 60s in Egypt. He has street cred among the Egyptians. He tried to insert himself with videos and the like in Egypt. It was ignored. And Al-Qaeda's been ignored. And I think the Arab Spring, one of the most beautiful things about it for me is it was a total repudiation of Al-Qaeda. They're trying to remedy that situation now with Syria, and the hope is that they'll get no traction there like they've gotten, as they've gotten on the rest of the Middle East.
Could I say one other thing about Syria?
You can say as many things as you want.
I mentioned the Israeli government. Syria is Iran's greatest ally. And were the Syrian government to fall, Iran is further isolated. And that in itself is a reason, I believe, to root for the fall of the Syrian government, particularly if we as a world community and the leaders in the region could manage that transition. There are, I think, some real upsides. Hamas has already left Damascus. Hezbollah, the Lebanon-based Iranian proxy, is also becoming very fidgety and looking for its next safe haven, if you will. And there could be, although again I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, real benefits to Lebanon, which has arguably been a client state of Syria. This isn't going to happen overnight, these more positive developments. But that's another part of the Syrian conflict that we should all keep in mind. And I interrupted them.
Well, you were going to say the same thing I was going to say, that Assad's days are numbered, and the fall of Syria, Syria's current regime is going to be a tremendous blow to Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. So.
Senator, I wonder if I can put you on the spot and ask you, what do you think the Middle East is going to look like in 5 years? Is Egypt going to be okay? I'm not going to ask the Admiral that because he'll have to deal with.
Yes. I'll answer if the Admiral can, and I'll make the comments as well. Look, each one of these countries has to be taken in its own right. Let me share a story and then let others comment on other countries. I was in Munich a few weeks ago at the Werkkunde, the International Security Conference. I know the admirals attended on a number of occasions. It started in 1960 when the NATO countries linked arms for different strategic and security reasons. But now it's attended by almost all the world's foreign ministers. One of the real highlights of that weekend, it's about 60 hours. You just put up with your jet lag. And for me, 60 hours is the equal to reading 60 books and what I learned viscerally in meeting people. We met with the Tunisian president, Jabali. What a man. He was 16 years in prison. I don't know, Chris, if you had a chance to meet him. He just smiles all the time because of what his country now has as an opportunity. Tunisia, about 4 million people, if my numbers are right, small little country, is on the best track right now to put some democratic institutions in place and also find some economic opportunities. We ought to invest in Tunisia. They need about $1 billion a year. That's not chump change, but it would be money well spent, and it could be part of a larger Arab, may have to rename the fund, Arab Spring Investment Fund that we ought to put in place. Libya is going to hold elections. There's a long way to go there, and I think we're all concerned about Egypt, and maybe I'll defer to the Admiral and others to comment on Egypt, because there's some good news there, but there's some developments that really concern us all.
I wonder if we can have somewhat of a change of focus to some of the Homeland Security issues, and we have one of the best experts here to talk about. Ken, if you were in the White House today, I mean, how would that have evolved from a few years ago? I mean, what are we really looking at in terms of things that we need to worry about? We seem to have the metal detector situation down at the airport, but what other things do we need to deal with?
Yeah, the metal detector thing is taken care of. In fact, as we were coming here, I was with my dad last night, and we had forgotten a little small penknife, and instead of them throwing it in the trash can, they actually had a process where they automatically stuck it in a FedEx bag and put it in the mail and sent it back to you, which I thought, that was great. That's a real step forward. So there's my shout out for TSA. Anyway, so we're seeing progress there. I think in terms of just generally counterterrorism, our general counterterrorism capabilities, I think it's important to look at how far we've come since 9/11 in the last 10.5 years. I think mention has been made here about how much has happened in regard to, I think as the Admiral was saying, in terms of our intelligence community, speaking with our military, speaking with other intelligence agencies overseas, and as I've seen it from my perspective, speaking with the law enforcement world. We are, in terms of coordinating and information sharing in the counterterrorism space, we have just come light years since 9/11. That speaks a little bit to where we were beforehand, but I think that's largely because we just didn't see the threat that 9/11 was until 9/11 happened. Once it did, that was the clarion call for real change, and we've seen that in the intelligence and the law enforcement communities, and obviously in the military and the diplomatic corps. I think that we have done a good job, frankly, at protecting the homeland, both by hardening it by the efforts of DHS and its partners, but also by interrupting plots before they become reality. I mean, you just read the newspapers this week. Some guy wanted to strap a vest on and go blow himself up in the U.S. Capitol, and the FBI and their partners did a great job. It was really a masterful piece of work at getting that guy. And there have been countless such episodes over the last couple of years, many of them undercover operations like this, where there are sting operations, but taking bad guys out and also disrupting operations, making any cell members who might be here thinking about doing bad things think twice, because they never know when the FBI might be on them. That is a level of sort of getting themselves into our adversaries' networks and operations that we just didn't have 10 years ago. And so I think I've seen tremendous progress through the time I was in government up until 2009, and I've continued to see tremendous progress. But as the senator said, they only need to get one up on us once, and we're hurting. So it's a big task.
Yeah. Admiral, any?
I would share Ken's sentiments that we've come an awful long way since 9/11, and heaven's sake, we should have, because it was a terrible attack on our country, the worst we've ever experienced, and the communities, as I mentioned earlier, have come together very well. We need to stay vigilant. There are a couple of things I would say. One is that one of our best sensors that we have is the American public. Yes. The Times Square bomber was picked off by somebody who walked by a car and something seemed wrong, said something to somebody, and lo and behold, that attack didn't take place. So, we're not out of the woods, and as I also mentioned, they only have to be good once. We have to be good 100% of the time. The other thing you may want to transition to this topic later, so I apologize for preempting you, is we have to keep our eye on the ball on the cyber piece. Because not only is this potential state threat, it's also a potential terrorist threat. You could have a super empowered individual, I think as Tom Friedman has referred to them, or a state proxy that has gone off on a tangent. And the next thing you know, you could have a very serious cyber attack on the country. So we got to keep our eye on the ball there.
Okay. I think maybe we'll go to some questions. Melanie, have we come to that moment? So I'm supposed to, these are questions from the audience, I'm supposed to read them?
Yeah, just a few of them.
Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. So I just read was this in the script? I didn't know that. All right. All right. Question number one concerns cybersecurity. And the question is, we know that foreign governments are targeting U.S. commercial and government computer networks. What type of threat does this pose to our country? Are we also at risk of large-scale cyber attacks from rogue computer hackers or international organized crime groups? What can private citizens do to recognize and protect against this threat? And this is from Mark Dickinson, Community Emergency Response Team. Ken, I think you're a perfect person.
Okay. Take what I just said about how far we've come with counterterrorism and how quickly that change started, literally, by the evening of 9/11. Take that as a comparison to where we've come in terms of our cyber defenses. It hasn't been the same complete success story. We were a little slow out of the blocks with cyber for a variety of reasons, partly because of 9/11. 9/11 sort of required a more kinetic, more traditional response, and we didn't focus on cyber. So I think we're a few years behind. It's just been a little slow. But it's quite clear the implications of the cyber threat. In fact, I think Director Mueller at the same hearing where the DNI testified said that he sees the cyber threat as becoming the #1 threat over terrorism to the United States national security in the near future. And it's understandable why. I mean, everything we do as a government, and I'm going to put aside private industry, but as a government relies on cyber. And we have some very determined, very effective adversaries out there. And there are countries like China, which have mounted huge efforts to go after every secret or anything even short of a secret in our government databases and our government systems, and also targeting our industries, our critical infrastructure industries, and trying to soak up as much in terms of trade secrets or any know-how that they can use to get a competitive edge over us in the economy. And that approach that they're taking requires a really robust approach on our side to respond to it. And I know this president has carried on that effort from President Bush to get a cybersecurity strategy in place, and it's a very complicated undertaking, and maybe the Admiral might want to address this, but it's very difficult because it draws on our military, NSA, it draws on DHS, it draws on law enforcement, and it's carried out in cyberspace, which is just an untraditional, difficult environment to actually sort of wage that kind of effort. So I think that is where we need to keep our eye on the ball for the near future.
Chris, when I speak to people about cyber, I tend to compare it to the physical world. And heretofore, in the physical world, we treated policy as, having bright lines, sharp borders. And when you start to get into the cyber domain, you find those borders fading away. The border between near and far has disappeared completely. At the speed of light, attacks can occur at the speed of light. The border between peace and war has almost disappeared. When somebody is snorkeling around on your computer network, you don't know if they're just doing espionage and exfiltrating industrial secrets, or whether they're leaving little presents behind, or whether they're actually conducting an attack. The border between civil and military is tough to see right now. For example, many of our military communications networks ride on civilian systems. So if the civilian systems aren't well protected, we can end up losing in the long run. And I could go on about the fading borders piece, but the key is for us to try to find policy tools that work in a land of fading borders that still protect our civil liberties and the things that we cherish as a nation. And that is, I think, a principal policy, a challenge ahead of us to make sure we get after that work as expeditiously as we can, because as Secretary Panetta has pointed out, this is our next Pearl Harbor if we're not careful.
We have another technology question. Maybe I'll ask the Senator to pick up on this and any other comments you want to make on cyber security. This question is, we have seen technologies provide new capabilities to leaderless collectives such as terrorism networks, flash mobs, and citizen movements. For example, the Arab Spring, the Occupy protests. So, A, how must our government change to address the emerging threats posed by the rise of more decentralized and adaptive collective action? And B, is fusion of information from social media and other social networking tools providing adequate, actionable intelligence? So this multidimensional question was posed by a member of my university, Dr. James A at the College of Business at the University of Denver.
I think it was Shimon Peres who said in that deep voice of his that when I grew up, I consulted the book. Now the younger generation consults the Facebook. And he was speaking positively of the developments in Egypt. It really is these devices that we all carry now that have helped fuel these movements. Technology that best liberates us and creates more freedom, which is right in our wheelhouse. So on balance, I think technology is very good news for what we believe in, what are our core principles. Another example of where this is benefiting us is in the so-called open source intelligence. OSINT is I can use an acronym. I'm sure I really have been studying. OSINT, open source information. There's an amazing amount of data out there that then through the use of computer programs and more, even more effectively, these smart young people that work in the intelligence world generate actionable intelligence on societies that have heretofore been closed or organizations that have been hard to penetrate. We should be rooting for the North Koreans, I think, Chris, you would agree, to get more and more cell phones. The Iranians, other oppressive countries where the people are oppressed. This is to be reveled in. The one area where it is a real concern we just talked about, which is cyber. And I've become convinced over the last couple of years this is a true set of threats. It presents a whole other set of questions. The Admiral alluded to one. When do you determine and how do you determine whether you've been attacked in a cyber setting by an enemy, or was it a fluke, or was it a hacker, was it a teenager somewhere? And how do you respond? Do you respond kinetically? If somebody takes out your radar system and blinds you, do you then put jets in the air to take out whoever blinded your radars, take out their technology? And how do you know? Or could a third party, by teasing out this situation, get two powers, two nation states, into a conflict that neither one wanted, and in fact neither one of them triggered? So there are a host of really important questions to be answered. We need to take up in the Congress legislation that would create an architecture that provide more direction, particularly into civil society, into the .gov and .com areas. The military and the .mil world is really hardening their systems, but I think the Admiral would tell you there are tens of thousands of attempts every day to penetrate the Department of Defense's computers. Tens of thousands every day. I don't want to dwell on this, but this is a really important area, and the Congress needs to particularly provide direction to the private sector that doesn't constrict the private sector's freedom, private sector's entrepreneurship. 85% of our infrastructure that's tied to cyber is in the private sector. So stay tuned for that debate to begin in the next few weeks. And there are a lot of competing points of view. You may have followed the PIPA and SOPA debate recently. There are some analogies to what we're now going to have to debate over how we manage cyber and cyber threats to the PIPA-SOPA debate we just recently had.
We have a lot of really good questions here, but apparently time for only one. I mean, there are some good questions on the question of domestic radicalization and how could that turn into a terrorism threat. We have questions about information sharing between citizens and government, but also a question on energy. And I must say, since coming to live in Denver, Colorado, you're looking at the biggest supporter of shale oil that you've ever seen, because I think it's high time we develop these domestic sources. So let me ask this question. This is from Jessica Jacobs. Energy, are there policies we should be implementing to increase our energy security and our national security while also transferring fewer resources to such undemocratic regimes as those in Iran and Venezuela, and the list can go on? So why don't we start with the Admiral here?
Well, I think it's self-evident. It goes without saying that if we were less dependent on foreign sources of energy, that we would have a lot fewer concerns out there in the world. And so it is an imperative. When you look at the troubles that we've lived with over many decades in the Gulf, it seems, there are precious few countries in this world who are energy producers, who don't have Dutch syndrome, where there's instability and trouble. The Norwegians, or my wife is of Norwegian descent, lovely. She's out there. The Norwegians they're not one of those countries, right? But many of them have been very troublesome, from Venezuela to the Gulf countries. Nigeria is having its issues right now. So the less we have to depend on that sort of thing, the less we have to do in my business.
Ken, can I get a comment from you on energy security?
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to $5 gallon of gas.
Come to Colorado, it's much cheaper here.
All right.
Yeah, the Admiral put it well and in a compelling fashion. I don't think we'll ever be, although politicians use this term, energy independent, but we can certainly be a lot more energy self-reliant. And we can work with nations that are a part of the civilized 21st century regime, who also want to be freed from dependence on all these countries that have abundant oil that don't share our values. It is more than ironic. I think God's giving us a real challenge here. But there's a way forward, and it's an all-of-the-above strategy. And I can brag a little bit on the Senate of the United States and tell you in the last Congress, we had a comprehensive all-of-the-above strategy that came out of the Energy Committee, bipartisan support, and it included everything from a green energy bank to a piece of legislation I've authored which would do research and development on small modular nuclear reactors like the Navy uses, to enhancing the production of shale gas, to encouraging R&D into carbon capture and sequestration on the coal side. Every technology has upsides, every technology has downsides. I'm a huge renewable energy advocate. I think many of you know that. I led the charge with my good friend Lola Spradley, the former Republican Speaker of the State House, to pass Amendment 37. So we had a goal for renewable energy in our electricity sector. We've blown by that first goal. We're going for 30%. We have the second highest goal in the country. We're going to reach it here in Colorado. It's driving job creation. There are, of course, environmental benefits, and it has enormous national security ramifications. So this is a passion of mine. We got to keep at it. We need a comprehensive policy, all of the above. We've got to find a way that we don't favor any one technology, but let them all compete. And boy, just think of the flexibility, Admiral, we'd have in our geopolitical posture in our leadership of the world. So let's get that done. I mean, we could get that done, and voters of Colorado said they'd had enough of me in 2014. I'd be happy as could be. If we get Simpson Bowles done too, by the way, we've got to get our debt on a sustainable trajectory. If we got those two things done, all my Republican friends here, help me get that done, then I'll retire and let somebody else have a run at it.